Hello, my name is Ryan Valma. I'm a principal and project manager with AECOM, the planning consultant for the Lee Highway Planning Study, also known as Plan Lee Highway. Arlington County is currently in phase 2 of the study. In collaboration with the county, we have completed the land use scenario analysis for the neighborhood areas along the corridor. Information about the process, including why we're studying Lee Highway, as well as the corridor-wide and neighborhood area concepts, can be found on the project website. This narrative presentation is an overview of the concepts for Neighborhood Area 2, which includes the John M. Langston, Yorktown, Terra Leeway Heights, and Leeway Overlea Civic Associations. Area 2 is in the western portion of the Plan Lee Highway corridor and extends roughly from Lexington Street in the west to the Langston Brown Community Center in the east. Through our engagement with the community so far, a number of shared aspirations have been voiced regarding this portion of the Plan Lee Highway corridor. Relative to land use, economic vitality, and housing, there's been a desire for more businesses and mixed use on the four corners of Lee Highway and North Harrison Street, along Lee Highway and on North George Mason Drive. Density and taller buildings in these areas seem appropriate, but mid-rise, not high-rise, and only if the parking is addressed, preferably underground or within the buildings, if transit access improved, and stormwater runoff is accounted for and mitigated or reduced. An appropriate transition in scale, height, and character are achieved, and we want to use open spaces and gradual height transitions to make that happen. Improving the aesthetics and function of the commercial highway frontage is important as well. And there's concern over losing the Lee Center because of its services and its easy accessibility by foot. Regarding public spaces, transportation, and urban design, there's an acknowledgement that people will still drive cars in the future, certainly in the foreseeable future, and that we'll need to manage a transition there as new mobility options emerge. And we need to improve parking areas, both the amount and the configuration, and pedestrian access at all of the commercial centers. Regarding historic and cultural resources, we want to highlight the history, both the buildings and the stories on those sites, and the culture in neighborhoods through art. The roadway should not be called Lee Highway. There's processes in progress to address that, separate from Plan Lee Highway. And there's the desire to experience and expand the arts in an integrated way across the corridor. The area should feel like a front porch community, neighborly and welcoming. And the core should have its own distinct character, while the neighborhoods continue to be a place where neighbors see and interact with each other regularly. A number of characteristics and planning influences are shaping the ideas that we have put together as well, in addition to the community input. From transportation connectivity and urban design, this is one of the narrowest segments of Lee Highway. Very unwelcoming to pedestrians and cyclists due to the narrow sidewalks and lack of buffers. There are left turn lanes that exist only at key intersections and that can lead to some trouble with traffic crossing the street at key locations. The setback buildings don't really relate to the street, don't welcome pedestrians, and put the parking areas out front, diminishing the walkability. The buildings have no relationship to the street, really, or almost none. And the proximity and accessibility for bicycles to the metro is challenging. We do have some parallel network on 22nd, 26th Street that are quite helpful though, and George Mason does connect across I-66, which gives us some interesting connectivity to the south. The east-west connectivity is strong both north and south of the corridor and can help with the parallel bike routes. Regarding the environmental aspects, the core areas have a very low tree canopy and high percentage of impervious surfaces. That sends significant runoff towards a number of the watersheds nearby. Building heights are typically around 3 stories or up to 3 stories. And in the core area, do have human scale, but really not a desirable urban form, and they certainly don't engage the street. Many of the corridor's gas stations and drive-through businesses are located here as well. There is significant development potential though. However, the parcels along Lee Highway in many cases are quite small, and they do constrain the opportunity to meet demand. The core area is surrounded by single-family neighborhoods, And that complicates the transitions there and makes it very challenging at times to make sure that redevelopment can be done in a sensitive way. There's shallow parcels, as we've mentioned, and at the intersections, the larger parcels exist, and they have the greatest opportunity for full redevelopment. So as mentioned before, the inspiration for these design concepts really did come from the community. It came on that idea of building on the front porch neighborly identity and transforming Lee Highway and these emerging social hubs into welcoming, walkable, and cyclable destinations of low to medium density. Again, really trying to achieve a distinctive character with diversity of businesses and really make sure that we maintain the ability of the adjoining neighborhoods to continue to be places where children play in the streets and people come together for a number of different opportunities as a community. And the images that you see on the slide here, these are just some examples of the types of experiences and the character and that type of thing that could be created along this portion of Lee Highway. Going back to the 2016 vision study can also give us some inspiration for how we move forward. Keeping in mind that even with the shallow parcels, there are creative ways to develop them and still achieve mixed-use vitality at modest scale. We can also look to create new development options that are not currently available to property owners and promote cosmetic improvements to existing structures to help them tie in with a more walkable environment in the future. So we created two different planning scenarios for Area 2. And the goal is not to choose one scenario over the other, but to work with you all to examine and explore the two options, see the different opportunities and challenges they might create, and use them to help decide the best ideas at each location within Area 2 to bring together and refine further in a concept plan for Area 2. And the goal of these two scenarios is to explore different ways of meeting the key objectives. And those objectives being to advance mixed-use development along Lee Highway, diversifying housing options, including affordable housing and aging-in-place opportunities, establishing good transitions, both in height and density to avoid potential impacts to surrounding neighborhood, enhancing Lee Highway itself to accommodate wider sidewalks, safe pedestrian crosswalks, street trees, and bicycle facilities, to relieve pressure at key intersections and reduce curb cuts along Lee Highway to eliminate potential vehicular, pedestrian, and bicycle conflicts as part of the Vision Zero goals for no serious injuries or fatalities in mobility settings within Arlington County, and to provide additional publicly accessible open spaces and stormwater detention and retention as integrated elements within these plans. So the two scenarios that we're talking about, they differ in a few significant ways. Scenario A assumes modest consolidation of some of the parcels along Lee Highway, usually in the first half of a block off of the highway, bringing those parcels together in order to facilitate more holistic redevelopment. Scenario B assumes a greater amount of consolidation of those parcels, usually to the first full block and the first parallel street to Lee Highway. It's important to note that that consolidation would take place by the private sector purchasing individual lots from the current owners and to bring them together to make larger development footprints that have greater flexibility for meeting the community goals. The county would not be consolidating those properties. They would not be taken. It would be a market-based purchase of that land that homeowners would have to agree to in order for it to happen. So we're looking at the differences when you assume a greater level of consolidation versus a smaller amount of consolidation. And we're now going to also look at a number of different ways land use, public space, and the connectivity that we create in these scenarios differ. We're now going to look at the two land use diagrams for each of the scenarios. So these diagrams have very generalized land use ideas that they are showing. If you look at the legend in the lower right, what we're highlighting in orange are places where there would be options to develop either commercial, low to moderate scale multifamily residential, or mixed use development. In the areas that are more yellow, this is where we would have two-family or low-scale multifamily residential that's incrementally integrated into the adjoining single-family edges over time, not wholesale redevelopment. The areas that are shown with the red stripe, they highlight places where we think there should be ground floor retail priority areas. This is not where we would be requiring that the developers provide ground floor retail per se, but we would want to make sure that the buildings that are developed can accept ground floor retail in the future so that they're designed, like in any main street, to provide a variety of uses at the ground floor. You'll also notice areas that are shown in blue. These are public properties today, part of the public facilities network, either Fire Station 8 or the Langston Brown Community Center and Secondary Program, and the Lee Community Center site. It's very important to note that we see that these sites need to provide public benefits in the future, especially as population grows. The exact program of public amenities and facilities on those properties is yet to be determined, but it's important that those sites remain publicly accessible and to provide public benefit. There could be a variety of ways of achieving those benefits and determining what they are, and that will be part of developing the concept plan, is when those particular ideas or the options that get put on the table for those sites. But it's important to note that they would remain something that provides public benefits. So in scenario A, where there is modest lot consolidation, we see that the parcels along Lehigh Highway can either be developed as commercial or low to moderately scale multifamily. Single-family residential lots behind those commercial parcels can also be converted by choice into two-family or low-scale multifamily structures as a transitioning land use. In scenario B, where there's larger lot consolidation, the parcels along Lee Highway and single-family residential lots can be combined together to encourage mixed-use development along Lee Highway, with low to moderately scaled multifamily in the residential edges at a scale that relates to single-family homes across the street. The traditional mixed use with a commercial ground floor and residential above, it's more feasible at the key intersections because of the visibility and the size of those parcels. It should be allowed along Lee Highway, but not required to allow the market to deliver the goods and services that are in demand as the planning horizon progresses. You'll also see that there's an important overlay for stormwater management that we'll talk more about in a minute. It's also important to note that we want to make sure that regardless of the frontage on Lee Highway and its use, we want to have those ground floors be activated. And we want to look for creative ways to encourage employment and new services to inhabit those ground floor spaces. So what we see here are just examples within the region and nearby of the types of amenities that can activate ground floor space above and beyond the cafes or the typical stores that we might imagine in ground floor retail settings. So beyond those settings, you may find things that are actually more like light industry, or instead of just a coffee shop, maybe it's also a roasting operation. Or there can be actually urban agriculture, which is already happening along Lee Highway. Opportunities for pet grooming and boarding facilities, co-working opportunities, and maker spaces that are actually places that people can join and come to from around the community to gather and explore different entrepreneurial ideas or hobbies. And there's also the opportunity to imagine how decentralized data centers will one day emerge in the market to help deliver 5G services, potentially connected and autonomous vehicles, And as more and more data is generated by all of us, there's going to be a need for different models of data centers. So we want to think about how that could effectively be integrated into the ground floors of and parking facilities of Lee Highway development. There are also a number of things to think about when we compare the two different development opportunities, whether it's modest lot consolidation or more full block consolidation. They can both help achieve Plan Lee Highway goals, but they do have some differences to them to consider. So we want to, in both cases, enhance Lee Highway to accommodate wider sidewalks, safer pedestrian crosswalks, street trees, and bicycle facilities. And we want to relieve pressure at those key intersections and reduce curb cuts. So here are two examples from just down the street along Route 7, West Broad Street in the City of Falls Church, where in one portion of the block on the left, you can see kind of a hybrid highway and Main Street type development that uses roughly a half block consolidation. It's a modest consolidation, and there's a drive-through bank on the ground floor with residential opportunities in a couple floors above that. So it's a hybrid. It's moving towards a Main Street approach, but it still has the relationship to highway-oriented uses. In scenario B, which is actually the next portion of the same block, the redevelopment goes for that has a greater consolidation and is deeper, going to the first full block. And in that case, the flexibility is created by having a taller building. That consolidation is more financially viable, and we end up with more accessible ground floor retail space, publicly accessible private space just down the block a little bit, more consistent streetscape, and greater opportunity for a variety of price points in residential. Now, all of that, there are trade-offs to think about, and both do help us meet our Plan Lee Highway goals. But this is just a visual comparison of what the two approaches might result in. It's also important to imagine that along this portion of the corridor, standalone commercial development or even modest mixed-use development can still orient to the highway economy that exists today and transition from it while engaging the street better. So these are just examples from some in the region and some from a little farther south that show how those standalone commercial uses can be oriented through design standards to work better with walkable environments. We're now going to go through a series of slides that highlight the differences in connectivity proposals between the two scenarios. Fundamentally, in scenario A, with imagining modest lot consolidation, there would be less overall additional street grid network created. In scenario B, where we're imagining a larger amount of redevelopment and consolidation of land, it would be both possible to create more connected street grid parallel to Lee Highway, but also required to do that in order to best serve that new development and existing neighborhoods. It's important to note that the new streets that we're talking about would be small scale, one lane in each direction kind of streets that would be neighborhood oriented and connect existing communities to new destinations and streets, as well as serve the new development. And so we'll walk through that in greater detail in a moment. In general, in scenario A, there's modest opportunities to create new street grid near the intersection with Harrison Street as a means of accessing new development near where the Safeway exists today. In scenario B, where there is greater lot consolidation, it opens up more opportunities and the need to connect more streets, especially on the north side of Lee Highway, connecting across between existing streets and the new development. And we'll talk in greater detail about that in a moment. The larger lot consolidation, it provides opportunities as well to additional opportunities to underground utilities, accommodate wider sidewalks, street trees, and bicycle facilities along Lee Highway, and establish a more uniform and cohesive streetscape. Again, we would need that parallel network to improve neighborhood access to existing commercial areas and to relieve the pressure on key intersections like Lexington and Harrison and George Mason. Both scenario A and B propose interconnectivity between adjoining parcels to reduce the curb cuts along Lee Highway, whether in the form of alleys that would connect behind those properties or connecting the parking facilities of each of those properties so that you didn't need as many curb cuts along the way. The next few slides highlight a few different scenarios and zoom in to key elements. So here, this diagram shows how near the Safeway, where the new roadways could possibly connect, with a new internal roadway network that would provide that adjacent access to neighborhoods and the new mixed-use development could take place. So you can see that those new roadway access points would connect neighborhoods to the west with North Harrison Street and access new mixed-use development near the intersection. Across the street, it could be possible to bring pedestrian and vehicular access to neighborhoods east of the Lee Harrison Shopping Center and connect from Lee Highway around behind the Harris Teeter to connect back to Harrison, accessing the new development and potentially connecting to the adjoining development so that they do not need to walk all the way around to get to the new amenities. Farther west, there are the opportunity to connect in scenario B, parallel network north of Lee Highway, extending 25th Street to connect eastward to North Jefferson and eventually eastward through the redevelopment to North Harrison Street. It's important to note that, again, none of these changes would happen against the will of the existing property owners. They would need to be part of that redevelopment by selling their property or combining it together in order to provide that redevelopment. And the streets that are connected there would be done so through that redevelopment by the private sector. And again, the important benefit here for the existing community is greater choice in how to move east-west without having to be on Lee Highway. In the eastern portion of the corridor, there's the opportunity to connect 23rd Road North and 22nd Road North more to connect from Dinwiddie Street east towards the top of the hill by Columbus Street. What this can also do is provide greater connectivity for neighborhoods north of the Garden City Shopping Center and to connect some of the cul-de-sacs near where Fire Station 8 exists today, so that there's easier movement and more options for people to walk and bicycle to nearby destinations. There's also opportunities to encourage alley conditions along the southern side of Lee Highway that act as a buffer and a border between single-family neighborhoods and the future redevelopment along Lee Highway. And there's great opportunities to connect pedestrian corridors along the North Emerson Street corridor and across Lee Highway as well to make the blocks more walkable, even if there is not new street connections proposed there. When we look at the streetscape itself, there's a number of improvements we can consider making. This was a very important part of our engagement so far. If we look at the farthest west portion of Lee Highway, on the left-hand side there, you see a diagram of the existing condition. 2 lanes in each direction, a median in the middle, a concrete median, and very little space on each side for pedestrians. There's also above-grade utilities to consider. The idea in that location would be to convert the median in the center to remove the median, move in the curbs, and provide additional space for pedestrians, street trees, and lighting. In this location, bicycle lanes would be focused on the parallel street network, specifically 22nd Street and 26th Street North, because they have a clear direct connection to the destinations people are looking to bicycle to, specifically the metro and the parks and schools north of Lee Highway. So in this location, the current right-of-way should be sufficient to make these changes because the bicycle infrastructure would be focused on the parallel network connecting to those destinations off of Lee Highway. It's also important to consider that in this segment, the outer lanes could be considered for transit priority or HOV priority at peak times in both, in order to facilitate greater transit access and more frequent, predictable service. For most of Area 2, though, we have the desire to include the bicycle facilities within the streetscape of Lee Highway to connect to those commercial destinations. This is an important outcome of the public engagement so far, was that while the parallel network is very important, it was very important to the community to also have dedicated bicycle facilities along Lee Highway to connect to those neighborhood serving destinations and to better connect the future development without everyone having to drive cars. It's also important to note that through our analysis and our coordination with DES, we've identified the need to have buffered or separated bicycle facilities from the traffic in order to not just allow bicycle connectivity, but to encourage it. Because of the volumes anticipated along the highway itself, it's safest to have those facilities be separated. So the idea for most of Area 2 is to, again, remove that median, move in the curbs, expand the sidewalks, and create that protected bike lane condition on either side, considering opportunities to bump out the curb for potentially for on-street parking at key locations, or even for flex zones that can allow for freight, small freight, FedEx, Amazon, that kind of thing, or ride-hailing services to pick up and drop off people more easily along Lee Highway. There's also the ability to bring in those bus and HOV priority lanes in the outer lane at peak times. Now, it's important to note, though, that this cross-section does require more right-of-way or more publicly accessible space than is currently available to us in this rather tight spot along Lee Highway. So there's going to need to be creative partnerships with landowners to achieve the expanded sidewalks and the bicycle infrastructure and those parking or flex zone ideas if desired. So potentially about up to 10 feet needed on both sides of the right-of-way in the narrowest conditions would be needed to make this possible. And so that would need to be determined and negotiated and worked out with the adjoining landowners to make that possible. But can it also build value for those landowners in creating better opportunities to engage with ground floor uses and provide the kinds of amenities that would attract customers and patrons to those locations? We want to look at these diagrams again, but this time from the perspective of the public spaces created. So again, with scenario A, modest lot consolidation likely means that there's less ability for the private sector to provide publicly accessible private open space because the land that they have to develop is much smaller, and financially there's not as much capacity to provide those amenities as a public benefit. In scenario B, with larger lot consolidation, there's the opportunity to potentially provide more of that space, and as more development would be taking place, there would be a greater need for it. You'll also see that there are overlay ideas for where stormwater detention can be incorporated in scenario B in 3 locations, specifically on the southern side of the Lee Community Center, at parcels just to the east, and potentially at the intersection of Harrison Street, at either development on either side of Harrison Street. The idea with those locations is that they would be used, besides being great public space, they could store additional runoff below grade and detain it so that it moves more slowly down through the system downstream. These locations have been targeted with the help of DES to identify how they would work well with the current stormwater management system. And again, being close to the top of the watershed, detaining the water there helps reduce downstream flood impacts. Here are just two examples of public open spaces that integrate stormwater management, even flood risk mitigation, with great gathering space and amenities for people. In both of these examples, you can see the water at the surface. It can also work to store that water in vaults below grade so that more of the public space is usable for gatherings, amenities, and community functions. We know that building heights are a critical issue to the community and a very important part of the plans for the future of Lee Highway. We want to be very sensitive to the concerns and opportunities and challenges associated with building height and the density of future development. The current building height standards for by right development vary, but for commercial or multifamily or single or two-family zoning, but they vary in general between 3 or 4 stories, 35 feet to 45 feet in height. The important thing to understand is that with redevelopment, additional height for properties along Lee Highway is going to be needed to accommodate parking and to encourage the improvements that we need to make along Lee Highway itself and the amenities for adjoining neighborhoods. So the proposed building height ideas that we're showing here in the next few slides, they're general recommendations and they are preliminary. They're based on establishing good transitions and achieving the desired community improvements overall. The increases in building height are a means to achieving those goals and to making the redevelopment economically viable. So those improvements are going to include stormwater management upgrades, intersection improvements, street grid expansion, the provision of publicly accessible open space, and potentially greater affordability contributions. Additional consideration for historic structures and their influence on building heights will be determined in the next step and will involve community input. And that may ultimately change the attitude towards height in key locations. The maximum allowable heights that are shown will not be granted automatically. They would be subject to site plan processes and county board review and approval. The objective overall, though, is to establish good transitions in both height and density to avoid the potential impacts to surrounding neighborhoods. And there are a number of tools that can be used to integrate new density and transition heights sensitively, like increased setbacks, landscape buffers, vegetative buffers, open spaces, alleys and service roads, and of course, tapering heights between neighborhoods. The images here highlight a few of the typical transitions we might expect between scenario A and scenario B. In scenario A, the transitions in use and in height would likely happen along an alley halfway through the block. So these are some examples from the nearby Columbia Pike corridor where you can see how those transitions between modestly scaled multifamily and mixed-use structures and adjoining single-family or two-family homes might happen along a alley or lot line. In scenario B, where we have that larger consolidation footprint, you can see how, again, from Columbia Pike, where there is increased height and public space and ground floor uses, engaging along where Lee Highway would be that greater height, but then stepping down to modestly scaled multifamily or townhome scale development across the street from single family homes. So these are two of the transitions that might be anticipated. These diagrams highlight that as well. On the left, the diagram depicts scenario A, where redevelopment leads to a modestly scaled multifamily structure with ground floor retail in the corner, in the lower corner of that diagram, in about half a block deep. And that down the street would probably likely still remain ground floor retail in more of a strip commercial fashion that you see today. But then there would be that transition in height along an alley to the existing homes, single family homes behind. And you can see in the cross section in the lower left how that transition from Lee Highway on the left to the single family neighborhoods might work, stepping from 5 stories in height down to the 3 or so stories for single family homes. In scenario B, we have greater consolidation of land imagined. And that does give the owner more opportunity to build taller buildings that incorporate more aspects of amenitized public space, potentially greater, more consistent streetscape improvements, stormwater management upgrades, emissions reductions, green roofs. That type of thing would become much more possible with a larger development because of the economies of scale that would be present. Also the opportunity for connections through to the existing neighborhood, but there are still opportunities to terrace the building down to provide a good transition with the adjoining single-family residential neighborhood along that street condition. So 2 different ways of managing the transition and incorporating differences in building height. Again, as a means of achieving the community benefits that are desired. So the 2 diagrams that we're looking at here highlight allowances in building height between scenario A and scenario B. In scenario A, we're proposing up to 7 stories of height along the north side of the intersection of Harrison and Lee Highway. Along Lee Highway itself would likely be up to 5 stories in building height for parcels that are redeveloping and consolidating along the highway, and terracing down to up to 4 stories in height in the single family residential edges along the existing single family neighborhoods. Scenario B, where it imagines greater lot consolidation, has the opportunity to transition differently. So there we see the opportunity for up to 7 stories in building height more consistently along Lee Highway, and then stepping down to 5 stories at the mid-block level, and then down to 4 stories again at the edge of the redevelopment area. And it's important to note, again, that the height allowances are also meant to help encourage the consolidation of property necessary and to provide those increased investments in stormwater management, publicly accessible open space, major intersection improvements, street grid expansion, and greater affordability contributions. So both of these scenarios help us achieve our planned Lee Highway goals. It's possible, though, that with scenario B, you'd be able to achieve those goals faster, but it does incorporate or does require more consolidation of property to terrace those heights down in a sensitive way. So as we come to the end here, there's just a summary of the fundamental major differences between scenario A and scenario B. Not going to read through all of them again, but we're just going to place them here for you to observe and understand as you're considering the benefits, opportunities, and challenges posed in each of these scenarios. And it's important to remember that as we move towards implementation, there are going to be trade-offs to consider. So there would be a base level of implementation that the private sector could be responsible to build, that would involve contributions to site improvements, and there would certainly be some affordability component of that as well. But there would then be additional incentives. The goal is to have additional incentives that would potentially, in exchange for greater height or density within those limits that we just discussed, could help spur additional community improvements from private investment in those key locations, like investments in the Lee Highway streetscape, stormwater management, publicly accessible open spaces, and those intersection improvements, street grid expansion, and greater affordability. It is also important to note that we do anticipate county investment in some of the larger transportation, stormwater, and infrastructure improvements that really only the public sector can do. But we want to focus those on investments on what the public sector is best at doing and allow the private sector the opportunity to help achieve a majority of the benefits along the corridor. Of course, there's going to be trade-offs in making that happen. Building heights, driven by economically viable development and desired for public improvements that we've been mentioning, is something that we're going to need to consider. Extent of change is also one of the trade-offs, whether it's just a half a block of redevelopment or whether the full block redevelops, again, with those sensitive transitions. The changes at the edge, whether we're integrating new housing types into the single-family residential edges to transition to the lower density, is an important topic to discuss. And complete streets trade-offs. Transforming Leigh Highway into a complete street that's safe, convenient, and comfortable, it's going to require partnerships with landowners to achieve those expanded sidewalks and bicycle infrastructure. And with regard to businesses, as we are redeveloping with mixed and complementary uses, that could impact and temporarily displace some of the existing more auto-oriented businesses in those commercial nodes. While adding additional residents can benefit neighborhood-serving businesses, it's going to take time and a while for the density to fill in and make that transition from an auto-oriented economy to one that's more walkable-oriented. So in the future, as we develop the concept plan based on your comments and suggestions and the analysis of these scenarios, we're going to be looking at certain data factors and reporting that back to you in the concept plan. Those are going to include everything from the number of dwelling units, the amount of commercial and non-residential floor area, the population change, the amount of jobs that might be created. We're going to talk about different lengths of new streets and opportunities that are being to be created there, and then a breakdown of land acreage for each of the different land uses we're talking about. We'll be talking about the change in impervious and permeable areas and how much area we've been setting aside to detain and retain stormwater in key locations. We'll talk about the change in canopy at that stage, and also the preservation and creation of housing affordability, how we're doing against our targets along the way there. So as we move forward and take the next steps in developing the preliminary concept plan, from a mobility standpoint, we're going to be modeling the transportation impacts of key changes in the mobility network to test how they work and what we need to do to refine the transportation network better. We're going to coordinate with Arlington Public Schools to evaluate the changes in student enrollment and to identify different models of school that can be added into the planning to meet public facility needs. We're also going to clarify the concept for public properties and identify future opportunities for public-private partnerships to develop and provide the public amenities that we need to match the growth along the corridor. We'll be clarifying future library concepts and identifying options for providing the core support services needed on public land to make these transitions happen. From an open space standpoint, we'll work with DPR to differentiate the use and character of each of the proposed open spaces along the corridor. And we'll work with the housing team to evaluate the achievement of affordability goals and our contributions towards that 2,500 unit target and identify opportunity areas to increase affordability and address the related trade-offs. We'll also clarify the housing type diversity being proposed. And from a cultural resources standpoint, we'll describe a framework for varying levels of preservation and interpretation on key properties based on the significant stories, people, and events of in the eclectic architecture of Leigh Highway. Thank you very much for your attention to this presentation. More information on Area 2 and the broader corridor-wide goals for Leigh Highway are available on the website. We look forward to talking to you in the future. Thank you.